Hello everyone, my name is Joseph Hwang, Senior at Bergen County Academies, and today is our 8th lesson in the Microeconomics course. We're going to be talking about subsidies today, and let's get right into it. So the next few lessons are all going to be about government intervention. So last week we talked about taxes, this week we're going to be talking about subsidies. In the next two lessons we're going to be talking about price ceilings and price floors. So subsidies. So what is a subsidy? So subsidy is money that is provided by the government. It's also called a grant, and it's a helping hand for many different types of groups. For example, firms, consumers, industries, markets, and these can be direct payments or loans. And for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to be focusing on subsidies for just firms and their effect on other stakeholders in the market, such as consumers and the government. So why give subsidies? So why exactly does the government grant subsidies to firms? Well, there are four main types of reasons that we have to be aware of. The first is more affordable goods. The second is to stir or increase production and consumption. The third is to support growth of industries. And the fourth is to encourage exports. So more affordable goods. Subsidies are given to producers or firms. And what this does is that it's basically government giving money, which means that it's going to incentivize producers to produce more. And the reason for this is because having more money, so subsidies is essentially like more revenue for a firm, which means they're going to have higher profit, and this subsidy can actually cover production costs. So firms will be willing to produce more of a certain product in return of having some of their costs covered by the subsidy. So what this does is that it makes the supply shift to the right, and this in turn, as you'll see in the graph later in the slides, is going to make the price decrease. So it's going to have a new intersection with the demand curve, and it's going to be a lower price. So now from the consumer's point of view, a lower price means that the good is more affordable. So there's more affordability. And this is very beneficial to lower income families. And so usually the government is going to give a subsidy for a good that the government deems to be more beneficial or like a necessity for families. And that's pretty similar to the next reason, which is more production and more consumption. Basically, the government granting a subsidy in order to increase the consumption and production of a particular good. So we just mentioned that subsidies act as incentives. So producers supply more things that consumers can buy, and consumers then buy more. And this increases the quantity of a good produced and consumed. So very similar to the reasoning of the first point, governments will grant subsidies in order to increase production and consumption of something that is beneficial in society. So this can be medication, if the government wants consumers to buy more medication or just wants more medication to be available. Other things, such as maybe masks in this time of the pandemic, we can think of an example like that, which masks are very essential to our well-being. So governments will often grant subsidies to goods that they think are very important to society. The third reason is to support growth of industry. So this is basically recapping the reasons I just said, but more specifically so, the main point or main takeaway here is that governments can grant a subsidy to a huge amount of firms at once, which is an industry, right? So grants is another word for subsidies. They lower costs, which means more profit. Increased output means more revenue, because more revenue increased. If you have more things that you can sell, and also the price increases, you get more revenue. Consumers buy. So the important thing here is that the consumers will buy since the price is lower. And you're going to understand this more when we see the graph, but it's going to lower the price. So although the subsidy gives the producers a higher price, this isn't the price that consumers pay. And we're going to see that in the graph. But the main point is that consumers will buy more too, since the price is lower. And so some industries that governments will support with subsidies are the steel industry, textile, solar power, and oil industries, and a lot more. Finally, the last reason, which is to encourage exports. So for the past few lessons, all we've been talking about is the domestic market, right? The market, in our case, would be the United States. But the global market is also very important. This is the market where there's imports and exports, and where all nations are going to be selling their goods to compete against other foreign nations. So essentially, subsidies lower the price of the good, which is kind of the general thing that we're constantly noting here. And so the world market is very, very similar to the domestic market because in the end of the day, it is still just a market. So there's going to be goods that are expensive, goods that are cheap, and from a consumer's point of view, and in this case, the consumers are the countries, they're going to want to have goods that are cheaper. So lower price means that the good is more likely to be sold and more likely to be more attractive to other nations. So subsidies on export goods, so particular goods that are going to be exported, such as steel, uh, machinery tools, make them cheaper. So more quantity of this good, as we just learned, subsidy also increases the amount of supplied, and also the lower price for these foreign nations is going to make a lot more profit for the domestic country, for the country. In this case, would be the United States, if we're going off that example. So now we finally go on to the graph of the subsidy. So we can start off, every single time we start with a graph, we're always going to look for the initial market equilibrium. And that is at the intersection between the S and the D curve, which is the supply and demand curve. So the market equilibrium price is P, market equilibrium quantity is Q. So what does the subsidy do? Is subsidy shifts supply to the right, or you can say down. And what happens is that the supply curve becomes the S plus subsidy curve. So the vertical distance between the S and the S plus subsidy curve is the subsidy per unit. So let's say at quantity Q1, the vertical distance between P2 and P1 is the subsidy per unit, or the subsidy, right? So there's a few interesting things to note here. So the first is that P2 is the price that producers receive. P1 is the price that consumers pay. So a lot of things, something that's pretty confusing for people who are new to subsidies is that they don't understand how consumers will like a product if it's more expensive than before. And they get this logic because they assume that since the firms are receiving a higher price, this also means that consumers have to pay that price, but that's not true. Because the reason why producers receive this higher price is because the government paid them this amount, this vertical distance, to get them from P1 to P2. So the consumers still receive the lower price from the original market equilibrium price. And so now, what is the amount of subsidy? It's just P2 minus P1 times Q1. So it's just this huge box right here. And yeah, that's basically the graph of the subsidy. So we're now going to move on to the effect on stakeholders. Remember, stakeholders are just anyone in the market who are involved in market transactions or just in the government interventional process. In every single government policy, we're going to be looking into the effect on stakeholders because it's very essential for economists to know how these policies affect stakeholders in order to communicate information to the actual government and let them know whether a policy should be carried out. So the first stakeholder is always consumers. So consumers receive two benefits. The first is the lower price from the original market equilibrium price. So the good is more affordable. The second is more quantity is being supplied in the market, which means the good is more accessible. So what this means is that not only is the after transaction income going to be higher, more consumers can actually obtain the good. And this is important if the good is like medication or like a necessity, food, and this helps a lot of families actually get their basic necessity goods every single day. And it also allows them to have income afterwards for other things, right? Because the price is lower, so it doesn't tax their income as much. So that's also very essential. The second stakeholder is producers, our producers. Producers also gain a benefit. I attached the graph here because it's a little bit easier for us to analyze what the benefit is. So the first is that they receive the higher price, right? Receive the higher price, which means they have more revenue, which means they're most likely going to have more profit because their costs can also be covered by the subsidy. So more quantity supplied as well. Q goes to Q1, which means more profit. And also because in addition to having more quantity, the price also decreased. So more is going to be sold. And since they're also receiving the higher price instead of what's actually being sold, like they receive P2 instead of P1, they're going to have a huge increase in revenue and a lot more profit. So the old revenue is P times Q, and the new revenue is P2 times Q1. So just from a mathematical, like geometrical standpoint, we see that this rectangle of P2 times Q1 is much larger than P times Q. And that signifies that they get a lot more revenue compared to before. The next is the government. So the government is basically the only one who really gets a loss here. And this is a pretty interesting concept because it's not just going to end with, the government loses money and loses a little bit of its budget because it gave some of that budget to industries, firms, consumers, etc. The interesting concept comes when we consider that the government needs to get revenue somehow or needs to get money from somewhere to grant subsidies to these firms, consumers, or industries. So there's a lot of ways that the government can do this. The first is that they may use a government interventional policy, such as the first one we just learned, which was taxes. Remember that gives government revenue. Or they may reduce spending elsewhere, which means they may reduce funding for maybe education, military, healthcare, so many different possibilities. So there's a lot of potential disadvantages, right? The government may deem at a particular moment that, let's say, taking about like $100,000 away from healthcare is not going to be that disadvantageous. But then in the long run, it may really hurt the society. Just jumping away from the economy, it may hurt the society a lot. So the key point is that the government needs to be careful to manage its spending, and it really needs to consider the reasons and its rationale on whether it is actually necessary and really important to grant a subsidy, because it's a lot of money and it's a lot of its budget that is going to be giving away to these firms, consumers, and industries. All right, we now move on to workers. So workers is also an interesting concept. We talked about it before when we were talking about taxes and the first government interventional policy. But here we kind of always connected. So when we talk about workers, we're always going to connect it with the firms. So we usually look at how firms are affected. And in the general case, if firms are beneficially affected, then workers will receive benefits as well. So this is exactly the case here. Subsidies to firms increases output, right? And more output means that it's going to require more time to produce this output. But this is bad, right? Because we looked at the determinants for price elasticity of supply way a long time ago, a few lessons ago. And we saw that one of the things was time. One of the determinants was time. And our explanation for that determinant was if a producer cannot supply enough, only can supply a fixed amount of supply due to the amount of time the producer has, this is going to give extremely inelastic supply. And what this can do is that it can greatly hurt the firm, because even if price increases immensely, they can only supply a fixed amount. So they can't supply more to get more revenue and they get more profit. So this is where workers comes in. come in, right? Because workers means that they can have more production, and this can decrease production time. And yeah, this is basically meaning that producers are going to most likely hire more workers. And this is also beneficial because we're going to be talking about later in the next one when we consider the effect on society. But it can decrease unemployment. And then we'll move on to society here. So we'll start off with the second point. So the benefit of hiring more workers to society is that unemployment may decrease because more workers are going to be hired. And this is really good because obviously people with jobs and having no income or no form of income is very disadvantageous to society, right? Because it's going to increase the poverty levels or the poverty rate. It's going to increase the income gap. So there's a lot of great things for granting a subsidy here because unemployment may be dealt with. Now, from an economic standpoint, there is a disadvantage for a subsidy, and this is an over allocation of resources. So if you look at the graph, I'll just go back here to the producers. Okay, so the market equilibrium, the price P and the QQ, right? The quantity Q. This is the natural equilibrium without any intervention, without any policy. This is just the natural equilibrium that was determined by the processes of supply and demand. So this is like considered the not optimal, but more just kind of like the baseline. Okay. So we see that due to the subsidy, the quantity in the market is more than the quantity from the original just natural market equilibrium. So what we say is that in comparison, by using the original market equilibrium quantity as like the baseline, so subsidy quantity is greater than market quantity, and that relative comparison, there is over allocation of resources. And what that means is that society may be producing too much of the good, but then there's also arguments where society was producing too little before, and that's why over allocation of resources is necessary. So it's for society as a whole, it's a win-loss situation. Foreign producers are the last stakeholders. We never saw these stakeholders before, so we're gonna consider an example here because it's easier to understand. So let's say we are the USA, which we are most likely. All of you guys are going to be from the United States of America, and we want to place subsidies on USA exports. So exports are cheaper to other countries, right? So we learned that if we put subsidies on a good, it lowers the price of it. So if exports are cheaper, they are more likely to sell. And what this does is that foreign producers are at a loss because U.S. exports are going to be cheaper than theirs. And if they're producing or selling a very similar good that the U.S. is selling, the U.S. is going to be cheaper than theirs. And what's going to happen is that the U.S. is going to gain the revenue that they're not going to be able to gain. And they can have a lot of losses of production costs of producing the good, resources producing the good. And if those goods aren't sold, like if those foreign producers don't get to sell their goods, they're going to have a huge loss. So what the foreign producers need to do, they need to lower the price even more than the USA exports price. So let's say the original market price was $5. Okay, US sells it at $4. And then if they want to be more attractive, what they have to do, they have to sell it either at the exact price of $4 or they have to sell it lower. And what this might do, depending on the production cost of producing that good, the foreign producers may lose substantial revenue, right? Because let's say the production costs were very high compared to that of the U.S. And if the price even lowers, it means less revenue may come in, and this will lower profit. So it's a very difficult dilemma for foreign producers. And the world market, it's very complicated because, some countries don't really think that's smart compared to the US, or even vice versa. The US has made bad decisions as well. It's just on a global scale, it has a very big impact on the actual individual countries as well. We now move on to the last concept here, which is going to be producer and consumer surplus. So yeah, we are back to these two concepts again. We talked about them in demand and supply. So let's see how subsidies affects each one of these surpluses. So producer surplus. Producer surplus, just to recap, is the price received minus the lowest price that producers are willing to receive. So firms receive price PS, right? And we have to note that the original producer surplus was according to this image, okay? Remember, so the original is determined by the intersection between the supply curve and the demand curve. This is the market equilibrium point, and so this would just be the triangle below the market equilibrium point, right? So that would be D plus H. But the new producer surplus is actually D plus H plus A plus B. So we see we get a gain of A plus B. And so this means there's more producer surplus, which is great for the society. And this also means that producers are more flexible in the price they're willing to receive and price that they actually receive. Very similar to consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the highest price willing to pay minus the price paid. So consumers pay PD according to this graph. And note that the original consumer surplus was G plus A, right? Sorry, it's not highlighted, but it's G plus A. It's always a top triangle. According to the original market equilibrium. Now the consumer surplus is G plus A plus D plus E. So you see here that there's kind of like an overlap. Like if we were to highlight this in blue, like E and G in blue, then their producer and consumer surplus would be sharing regions A and D. So there's a kind of an overlap here, which is pretty interesting because we usually don't see that, right? We usually are bounded by the price here. We're just bounded by it, by the market equilibrium price. So they just have their respective quadrants, but there's an intersection here, which is pretty unique and pretty cool to see. So the last thing is welfare loss. So we talked about welfare loss previously. It's just benefits that society loses, and it's also referred to as deadweight loss or social welfare loss. So post subsidy, right? Or let's talk about pre-subsidy first. So before subsidy was implemented, we had quantity QE and price PE, and now we have quantity QS and then price PB for consumers and PS for producers. And the government, so let's look at what the government, so the government pays this whole entire region here, right? Including the red, so the red and the blue. Because remember, we talked about in the third slide, we said that government, what the government pays for the subsidy is PS minus PB times QS quantity. And so the government loses this much. But the gain in producer surplus and consumer surplus is only these blue regions. So they don't gain this red region here. So what this means is that the government loses more than what the producers and the consumers gain. And so this represents a loss. And so what society loses due to this quantity is the red triangle. So some may argue, why is that such a big deal? Because compared to the original quantity, there is actually more producer and consumer surplus, right? Because if you look at the original market equilibrium, we would just have these triangles, but now we have these huge ones. So isn't society better off? Well, a lot of economists argue that if there is deadweight loss, this represents inefficiencies in the market. And so if you looked at the original market equilibrium without the subsidy, there was no deadweight loss. So economists would argue that this market equilibrium actually was more efficient, right? Because economics is all about efficiency, and it's all about using scarce resources. So the fact that there's a deadweight loss can display that producers are not using scarce resources in the most efficient way possible. And this is, in the long run, could be very detrimental to society because it means a lot of resources are going to waste. And so yes, although producer and consumer surplus have gotten larger and have gained more, the fact that there is social welfare loss and deadweight loss is a concern, and it's something interesting to note. So that basically wraps up our lesson. So just to review what we learned today, we talked about subsidies. We talked about what they were, how they're just money or grants that are lended from to firms, consumers, and industries by the government. We also talked about why governments grant subsidies, how they can be used to increase consumption, make goods more affordable, and how the graph of the subsidy actually displays these reasons, right? How the graph of the subsidy is different from a market equilibrium graph just by the natural processes of supply and demand. So we saw how the implementation of a subsidy shifts the supply curve to the right. It gives a higher price for that will be received for producers and also a lower price for consumers. We also looked about the effects on stakeholders. We looked about the effects of consumers, producers, government, workers, society, and foreign producers. We also just reviewed producer and consumer surplus, how the subsidy makes it different, how it changes it, and also finally welfare loss and deadweight loss. So this concludes our subsidy piece of government interventional policies. Next, we're going to be talking about price controls, more specifically price ceilings. So definitely look forward to that. Thank you for coming out to this video and learning more about microeconomics.